The bomber that dropped a message instead of a bomb. The secret that ended a battle, the sky of destruction in the pilot. No one expected a rebel. During the height of World War II, when the skies above Europe were filled with steel, fire, and the roar of engines. A particular bomber squadron gained a reputation for striking with mechanical precision. Among them flew a man whose name rarely appears in official records, but whose actions would quietly alter the course of a brutal confrontation. Captain Elias Mercer. He commanded a standard medium bomber, a machine engineered for destruction, and the missions assigned to him were no different precision strikes, high-risk raids, and operations designed to wear down an enemy already pushed to desperation. Everything about Mercer suggested he was a disciplined officer, punctual, analytical, respected by his crew, and known for never questioning an order. Yet, beneath this layer of obedience, he carried a private doubt that had been building with every mission flown. The battle in question was already infamous for its violence. Two opposing armies were locked in a struggle for a strategic corridor, a piece of land whose importance far outweighed its size. Villages burned, fields turned to wasteland, and thousands of soldiers, many barely old enough to shave, were pushed into a fight that offered no mercy. Reconnaissance photos revealed that the enemy was preparing a last stand, reinforcing trenches and moving artillery under the cover of night. Command headquarters ordered Mercer's squadron to conduct a devastating strike meant to break the resistance once and for all. It was supposed to be routine, fly low, drop the payload, return before enemy fighters enter. But the night before the mission, Mercer received a radio transmission no other pilot in the squadron heard. The voice identified itself as an officer from the opposing army, a man who claimed to know Mercer's father, who had gone missing years earlier under circumstances the military never explained. The message hinted that the battlefield below was not what Allied planners believed. Among the entrenched forces were civilians being forced to serve as human shields. Destroying the position, the voice warned, would slaughter hundreds of innocents and bury the truth of Mercer's father forever. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Mercer shaken and unsure whether he had heard truth, deception, or something else entirely. By dawn, his dilemma had grown into something he could no longer ignore. If he fulfilled his orders, he might be responsible for a massacre. If he refused, he would be court-martialed for insubordination or worse. As his bomber lifted into the gray morning sky, his hands gripped the controls not with confidence but with a sense of impending judgment. The battle below waited for destruction. Mercer, however, carried something else entirely. The message written in the dark, and the crew who didn't know the truth inside the cramped fuselage of the bomber. The crew prepared for what they believed to be a standard strike. The bombardier checked the release switches. The navigator traced their route in the dim red light of the cabin. And the gunners scanned the horizon for enemy fighters. None of them knew that Mercer had replaced the central bomb in the payload with a sealed metal cylinder. Inside, it was a handwritten message, something crafted in secrecy the night before while the rest of the squadron slept. Mercer had agonized over every word, knowing the message had to be persuasive enough to halt the battle, revealing enough to shake commanders, yet vague enough to protect him if what he wrote was not a political declaration nor a confession, but a plea rooted in evidence, coordinates, eyewitness accounts, and a detailed description of the civilians trapped inside the enemy-controlled bunkers. Mercer's plan was beyond risky. If the cylinder malfunctioned, if the enemy misinterpreted it, or if his own superiors discovered it, the consequences would be catastrophic. The bomber was equipped with cameras that automatically recorded every release, meaning any deviation could be analyzed later. To create plausible deniability, he adjusted the flight altitude and path just enough to mimic turbulence, hoping the camera footage would show a release triggered by mechanical error. The crew felt the aircraft's subtle deviations, but assumed the rough air was responsible. Only Mercer knew the truth. He was steering between duty and conscience, trying to prevent a tragedy without condemning himself. As they approached the target, anti-aircraft fire erupted from the ground. Tracers streaked upward like burning arrows, shaking the plane with violent tremors. The bombardier shouted for final confirmation. Mercer hesitated. His pulse hammered so loudly he could barely hear the engines. The crew waited for his order. Instead, he silently pulled a lever that released the message cylinder. On the camera, it looked nearly identical to a dropped bomb. No explosion followed, only a metallic glint as the object vanished into the fog below. The moment the cylinder fell, Mercer felt something inside him break and reform at the same time. He had crossed a line that no wartime pilot was supposed to cross, placing human life above the strategic objective. The crew, unaware of the truth, announced they were ready for a second run. Mercer refused. He claimed cloud density had obscured visibility and that a second pass would be suicide, given the increasing anti-aircraft barrage. With tension rising on all sides, he turned the bomber around and headed home, praying that the message would reach the right hand's end, that his own crew would never discover what he had done. The message that reached the ground and the decision that changed the course of a battle. The metal cylinder struck the ground not in the trenches of bunkers, but in a patch of mud between two shattered buildings. Soldiers from the opposing army spotted it, believing at first it was an unexploded ordnance. Cautiously, they approached it, noticing its unusual shape and the absence of explosive markings. When they pried it open, they expected a trap. Instead, they found Mercer's message pages folded neatly, protected from the wet earth. The commanding officer on site, Colonel Anatoly Vorin, read it under the dim light of a lantern. The more he read, the slower he breathed. The coordinates and descriptions aligned with intelligence reports he had been receiving but had dismissed as the trenches behind his front line indeed held civilians' families displaced by the fighting and forced into labor under threat of execution. The message also contained a warning. A full bombing run was scheduled within the hour, and resistance would be futile. If Vorin did not evacuate immediately, the civilians would die. The colonel faced an impossible choice. He could remain silent, preserve his defensive line, and hope the message was a trick. Or he could risk withdrawing forces, exposing his army to attack and losing a strategic position that had cost hundreds of lives to defend. Vorin had seen enough war to know that truth often arrived disguised. But the precision of the details convinced him this was not enemy propaganda. This was a warning sent by a man who could not bear the burden of silent complicity. Within minutes, Vorin ordered a partial retreat. His officers protested, suspecting a trap, but he dismissed them. As artillery thundered in the distance, he directed his soldiers to escort civilians out through a hidden supply corridor. Hundreds fled through the chaos, stumbling through smoke and debris as the front lines reshaped around them. When the retreat was complete, Vorin sent a reply, a coded radio transmission using the same frequency Mercer had heard the night before. He confirmed receipt of the message and revealed that he did indeed know Mercer's father, who had been captured while aiding foreign resistance fighters years earlier. Vorin asserted that the elder Mercer had died honorably while protecting prisoners from execution. The Allied bombing never came. Intelligence officers studying aerial footage concluded the enemy had already abandoned the position. Commanders canceled the strike, believing they had successfully forced a retreat. In reality, the withdrawal had been orchestrated not by military pressure, but by a single message dropped from the sky, a message that prevented a massacre and shifted the front line just enough to shorten the battle by several critical days. The secret buried in reports, the pilot who stayed silent, and the legacy of a message. When Mercer returned to base, he was met with suspicion. Command officers questioned why he aborted the mission and why his aircraft deviated from the planned route. Mercer relied on the turbulence narrative, supported by weather data and the violent anti-aircraft fire captured on gun camera footage. The explanation was plausible enough to avoid formal punishment, but whispers circulated throughout the squadron. A few pilots joked that Mercer was losing his nerves. Others believed he had simply miscalculated under pressure. Mercer accepted the ridicule silently, knowing that the truth could never be written in a report or spoken aloud in a briefing room. What Mercer did not know was that Colonel Vorin had filed his own report preserved deep in Soviet archives describing the mysterious message and the pilot who had risked everything to send it. The document remained classified for decades, its existence known only to a handful of post-war analysts. When the Soviet Union collapsed, historians gained access to thousands of wartime files. Among them was Vorin's report, still intact, still bearing the same coordinates, descriptions, and handwriting samples photographed for preservation. The dossier identified Mercer only as the pilot who delivered warning, noting that his actions had prevented the deaths of hundreds of civilians and contributed indirectly to the early conclusion of the regional battle. Mercer lived the rest of his life in quiet anonymity. He received no medals, no public recognition, and no mention in official histories. Interviews, he spoke only of. Complicated days and choices no man should have to make. Not even his crew learned the truth. They remained unaware that their mission had become a turning point in the battle they once considered routine. Mercer carried the weight of his secret until his final days, convinced he had done the right thing, even if the world would never know. Years later, researchers, cross-referencing Soviet archives with Allied flight records, uncovered the connection. They identified Mercer's aircraft, his mission log, and the exact stretch of battlefield where the message had landed. Though the full story could finally be told, the pilot himself was long gone, leaving behind only fragments, handwriting samples, coded transcripts, and testimonies from those who unknowingly participated in his moral rebellion. Today, historians view Mercer not as a traitor or renegade, but as a rare example of a soldier who placed humanity above destruction. His act, small in motion but immense in consequence, became one of the quietest and least known moments of defiance in the entire war. The bomber that should have delivered devastation instead delivered a message, one that ended a battle, saved lives, and bridged the silence between two enemies who momentarily recognized the cost of war. And because of a single decision made in the cold sky over a burning continent, history bent, however slightly, toward mercy.